How many NPR junkies are in the audience? Okay. You all know Scott. You all know that you can't have a Saturday morning without a dose of Scott Simon, right? You all know that he has reported from 50 countries, 5 continents, and dear God, 10 wars. But what you may not know is what a fabulous author he is. Over the last few weeks, in preparation for today, I have read 2 of his books. And as the recovering politician, I had to start with Windy City, which is about the mayor of Chicago, his beloved hometown, being found dead. And it's a mystery, and it's joyful. There's so much character and ethnicity and politics, and it's a really fun read. If you like politics at all, it's a murder mystery with a great dose of political intrigue, and I recommend it. His newest book is, again, from the heart. Scott writes about what he loves. He loves baseball, he loves politics, and he adores his family. And this is about how he and Caroline came to meet and bring home their 2 beautiful daughters who are here with us today. And I see Caroline coming to join us now. And Lena and Elise. Hi, you want to wave? Hello. Well, we're really glad that you all are with us. Our cousin Aurélie is here. Bienvenue aux États-Unis et à Gaithersburg.
She's with us for a couple of months, and she doesn't speak English.
Okay. Nous pouvons parler seulement en français. Plus tard. Okay. In any case, we were told to be short and sweet in our introductions. Hard to get a political person to do that, but we're here for Scott Simon and not for anything else. I am going to remind you again, please, this is the 2nd annual Gaithersburg Book Festival. We want to continue to improve it. There are questionnaires in the back, surveys. Please give us your frank feedback. And the winner is one is going to be chosen, and you will win a color Nook. So please return them and take just a moment in the table at the back. And the last thing I'll say is after Scott speaks, there will be some time for questions and answers, and we're going to ask that you come to the microphone and make sure you speak nice and loudly so we can all hear your question. With that, I'm delighted to welcome to Gaithersburg, Scott Simon.
I'm glad you like Windy City. Very good to be here, and I apologize for the late arrival. It was just hard getting here from the District of Columbia. And however, it was kind of thrilling to pull up in the golf cart, I don't mind telling you. And the best part is I don't actually have to play golf, right? I just arrive at the cart and get off. I'm going to begin immediately, since my beautiful wife and family is there, and they might disappear at any moment because I think I saw a kettle corn stand. What, baby? A bar, you said? A park. All right, I'm sorry. Well, that's part of being in a French family. Aurélie, since you can't understand a word I'm saying, you're going to have a really good time here. Ask her. She, when she began living with us just a week ago or something like that, she said, in better English than I have French, our little girls speak French exquisite, thanks to their mother. And she said to me, I want to speak English as well as, I want to speak English as well as Elise. And I said, I want to speak French as well as Elise. Let me just read this if you observe the cover of the book and observe my wife, who is departing, I hope not permanently. I have a picture I keep in whatever office I have and will ever have. My wife, a soft raven beauty with a radiant smile, holding Elise aloft in her graceful hands, almost like a fluttering dove. I have made my wife smile occasionally. I have never made her smile like that, even once. Elise is in a small white silk Chinese dress that we got, and wish we had a better story, at the Nancheng Walmart, and she's also smiling. A grand, goofy, and mischievous smile that makes people smile back, laugh, and say, "What personality?" It's certainly a smile that discloses a hint of the charismatic and clever little girl that she's become. Because those smiles are so euphoric and Elise's silk dress is immaculately white like swaddling clothes, many people assume it was taken at the moment she was placed in our lives. Actually, the photo was taken about 3 days later, after Elise had grown tired of crying and had learned that however goofy and immature we were, the new people who had appeared in her life were easily manipulated into fetching egg custard, Cheerios, ice cream, whatever she wanted, as she so much as looked at us. Our last morning in China, we awoke in the high thread count sheets of a classy hotel in Guangzhou. I think some other people here might have had that experience. Elise was giggling in her crib by then. I wondered how a little girl from the wilds of rural China could wind up having a laugh that reminded me of Jerry Lewis. I whisked her down to the breakfast buffet. Smoked fish melted in her small mouth. Maple syrup dribbled down her chin. Our flight would leave in just a few hours. As we sat behind a huge glass pane overlooking the Pearl River, I traced the route that would take us from Hong Kong over Siberia, the North Pole, the snowy peaks of the Canadian Rockies, and finally the towers of Chicago. I promised her that soon she would see New York, London, and Paris. I promised her that soon she would ride a pony, dance ballet, see the cherry blossoms, and eat guacamole. I think we've done that pretty much. I sang to our daughter, forgive me, Pearl River, wider than a mile, we're crossing you in style today. I actually had lyrics to the whole song, but you know, it's ruinously expensive. You have to pay for the rights even to satirize song lyrics, so I just make do in the book with these two lines. Elise spent 18 of the 21 hours aloft, snuggled and sleeping on her mother's shoulder. Business class travelers who would ordinarily blanch on seeing a red-faced infant arrive in their premium class precincts put down their Financial Times and smiled. A few even gingerly chucked Elise's chin. On arrival in Chicago, we were directed into a holding area. We sat alongside families from Poland, Ethiopia, South Korea, Kenya, and El Salvador. No matter where their flights had begun, the small boys and girls who'd been dressed in pressed white shirts, dark suits, and plaid skirts to fly over oceans in the middle of the night and enter the United States. An immigration official in a broad brown hat called out, "Simon family." We smiled at the name, which we were just getting used to. He gave a last look at white forms separated by pink and green tissue papers. "Well, everything seems in order, Simons," he said, handing over the folder and pointing to a place in the customs hall about 20 feet ahead. "When you cross that line," he said, "your little girl is a citizen of the United States." Then he put one of his huge hands gently under our daughter's chin and smiled. "Welcome home, sweetheart." Well, this is a book that my wife and I had once vowed that I would never write. We had a social worker for both of our adoptions, so I suppose a number of people here have had. And she told us that people who adopt children, especially children from China, are the most overly literate group of people on earth, because we can't seem to bring a chia pet into our homes without writing a book about it. You know, a lot of these volumes are privately published, and people have sent them to us over the years. And they're very good and very touching. And they often have punchlines in Chinese, the way my Uncle Sheldon used to tell jokes with Yiddish punchlines. But they all seem to end when the baby comes home. And of course, the real adventure begins as children grow up and you become a family and you learn how little mere blood and genes count in your daily life with each other. Now, I think what changed in terms of the attitude that Caroline and I had about me writing a book like this, I spoke about our family a few times on the air, not merely as many times as people think, but we had an editorial meeting last summer, and at my place on the conference table, there often is a pile of books people want me to take a look at, and on top was you might have seen it come out last year, was a book with the title something like "Shut Up About Your Perfect Child." And I said to our producer, Bridget Kelly, I said, "Well, you know, Bridget, it's a catchy title, but it's really not really the kind of book we do." And she said, "We don't want you to do an interview, we just want you to read it." But Caroline and I became aware of the fact that the story of our family had become interesting to people, and maybe even in some way important. And my wife and I have grown to believe very deeply in adoption. Not because it's a good thing to do, but because it does good things for us. We've grown to feel that it's a miracle, a flesh and blood miracle, as miraculous as childbirth. and just about as ancient. I actually did a little research into the history of adoption. Interestingly, it's, nowadays you actually begin with your conclusion, then find the research to support it. But I actually did a little research, and you can read accounts that stretch back into ancient times. Adoption is as old as childbirth, or as we refer to it now, childbirth in the traditional Abraham and Sarah begetting manner. And you read ancient accounts, and you understand that there would be these blistering battles between ancient peoples. And as the victorious warriors would move over the blistered landscape, they would still often stop and pick up children who had been left behind, the children of people they identified as their enemies, and yet they brought them into their lives. I think we're wired to pick up and care for those children who were left behind, thrown aside, abandoned, relinquished, or as in the case of our daughters, given up at great pain and personal sacrifice by the birth mother. I think my children are safely away. We didn't begin at this point. I think it's only fair to ask how we got there. So let me read a section that I believe is entitled Intimate Intrusions. I wish you could understand this orally. The impulse to bear as well as to care for children is deep. My wife and I tried until we were black and blue from all the ways there are of getting pregnant these days, traditional and state-of-the-art. There are a lot of words to describe a couple who are trying to reproduce on demand. Romantic isn't among them. I make no attempt to describe my wife's experience in the book, and it would be boorish to ask her when you run into her at the kettle corn stand, but you're invited, I write from my perspective, you're invited to take a seat in the waiting room of a fertility doctor. Med nod tightly, smile wanly, and feign profound interest in an old National Geographic. You do not ask your seatmates, and what brings you here? When their name is called, you do not pump your fist and shout, "Go get 'em, Tiger." When your name is called, you do not smile, wink, and swagger out saying, "Back in a flash." An earnest young man takes you through a subdued hallway that looks less like a hospital passageway than a corridor in an airport motel. Oh, if these walls could speak. He shows you into a room outfitted with a recliner lounger, large screen television, tissues, and piles of magazine that are not National Geographic. He hands you a small plastic cup. No thanks, I never drink before 6. The nice young man asks if he can get you anything else to make you comfortable. Taco chips? A brewski? Hey, can I watch a ball game in here? Poor choice of words. He closes a door. You hurry to lock it. Oh, sorry, sir, I thought reproductive services was the photocopier. You have to think about that one for a while. Thank you. You hear the man slide some kind of sign into place. Quiet? Men at work? You quickly survey the inventory of videos. Where were these when I was a teenager? Every video seems to have whips, chains, nymphs, or studs in the title, and I don't mean Turkle. Frankly, my dear, I'd rather see Casablanca. You leaf through magazines. Playboy is on the top, but the interview inside with Quentin Tarantino distracts me. It's a sad admission of age, isn't it? I admonish myself, bear down. I pick up another magazine that makes Playboy look like The Economist. But the effect is not invigorating. Finally, I lie back and think of England. It's been working for centuries. The deed is done. The eagle has landed. I came, I saw, I conquered, or perhaps that's in reverse. Very subtle in this section. On my first occasion, I placed my contribution through a small revolving door designed to receive it, similar to the portal used to pass food to prisoners in solitary confinement, I noticed, and told a nurse I filled a couple of cups, in case you need extra. She sighed. Every man makes that joke. Another time, I was led into the chamber by a young medical technician who looked up from his clipboard. Hey, he said, these Scott Simon? I nodded. He called out as he closed the door, have a good day, Scott. I wondered if doctors later looked at the contents of a vial under a microscope, observed the sperm kicking and swimming, and remarked, you know, they don't look like he sounds. I'm just going to go ahead a bit. I joke about all of this now because it still hurts. If you're trying to create a child and can't, you feel that you are a failure. Do you feel that you've fallen short at one of the few things that scientists, creationists, Jesuits, Lubavitchers, atheists, polygamists, and monastic Buddhist monks agree that every living thing from a gnat to an elephant was put on this earth to do? Seed new life, continue the species, keep creation going. 15-year-old girls produce children with 16-year-old boys in the back seats of cars. Why can't two loving adults who have contemplated parenthood and are prepared to offer love, patience, and devotion come up with enough chromosomal matter to stick together and create a child? You feel useless, worthless. You feel that somewhere deep inside your cells you've betrayed and failed the person you love most. So you lower your doors, you give injections, you jump at the jangle of the telephone and wait for results. You wait for a miracle. Well, a miracle was ahead. We just didn't know yet that it would take the form of two small girls who would be born to people we didn't know on the other side of the world. Well, there, for a little comic relief, that section, I hope. Another thing that my wife and I decided when Random House asked if I'd do a book like this, we didn't want to extrapolate too much from our own personal story, because I understand you met our children briefly. They're 8 and 4. My wife and I understand that we're still at the rapturous stage. The teenage years are ahead, and we are told that demonic possession is very common. And also you adopt and you begin to understand a lot of people in your circle of friends. You never knew this before, or at least you never sort of copied that fact into your consciousness before. Their families are blessed by adoption too. So I tell vignettes here about, I guess, 12 other stories. My colleague Steve Inskeep, who was adopted by Roland and Judy Inskeep in Carmel, Indiana. Thomas Lauderdale, the founder of the group Pink Martini, wonderful music group out of Portland. Steve Levitt, the University of Chicago Freakonomics professor. He and his wife Jeanette lost a little boy, Andrew, when he was just 1. They now have 2 daughters adopted from China. Jeff Seller, the Broadway producer. He grew up adopted by a couple in Detroit, and now he and his partner Josh have 2 youngsters. Judge Ann and Alderman Ed Burke in Chicago, they have 5 adopted children who were adopted and went through a celebrated court case. Martin Simon, the son of the late senator from Illinois, who opened his life to a mother who had given him up for adoption. And in fact, I'm going to read a little of his story, if that's all right, because as Cheryl pointed out, I do have a love of Chicago and politics, and Martin's the son of a famous Illinois politician. Let me just read a little bit of that section, if I could. By the way, in Gaithersburg and the Beltway area, when you say Paul Simon, you mean the senator. I've made a lot of appearances in the book where they think I'm talking about the guy who, bridge over troubled waters, and I'm always a little bit thrown by that. Alas, I'm not related to either of them. Paul Simon and his wife Jean were both members of the Illinois House of Representatives when they married in 1960 and began to have a family. They had a daughter, Sheila, now Lieutenant Governor of Illinois, by the way.
My classmate, high school classmate.
Your high school classmate, really? Oh my gosh, she's now Lieutenant Governor of Illinois. Is she remotely qualified?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I thought I'd ask, okay? I mean, Yeah. Oh, of course, okay. All right. In the paperback version, I will make that amendment. After a series of miscarriages, they decided on adoption. They specified that they'd like a baby boy. Within a few months, they got a call from their minister. He'd learned a healthy baby boy had been born to a teenage mother who decided she couldn't keep him. Would Paul and Jean be interested? They were. One thing, Paul, said the minister. I don't know how you and Jean feel about this, but the boy, yes, he's American Indian. Martin Simon has some of the same deep bass chuckle in his father as he tells the story. My father said, well, that's just fine. It was the 1960s. Paul and Jean didn't go to workshops or culture groups or take their son to Native American conclaves, but they treated his heritage with interest and respect. By the time Martin Simon was growing up in the 1970s, America had taken a turn. Native Americans were portrayed not only sympathetically, but heroically in popular culture. Many children are more eager to be Indians than cowboys on the playground. Martin grew up with the Paul Revere and the Raiders song Cherokee Reservation ringing in his head. He walked around singing, Cherokee people, Cherokee tribe. He could feel the blood of a great, shrewd, and dauntless Cherokee chief surging through his veins. He identified with their noble and sad history. Paul Simon was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1984 and joined the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. He attended hearings on the reservations, and while he never pretended that he possessed extra knowledge because of his son, he acknowledged that it gave him an extra interest. In 1989, he signed a petition asking the University of Illinois to replace Chief Illiniwek as the official symbol and mascot of its sports teams. The Economist wrote about the Chief Illiniwek controversy and gently noted, Mr. Simon's adopted son is Native American. As the Simons moved around between Troy, Springfield, Carbondale, Illinois, and Washington, D.C., would have been Montgomery County, I guess, another change I'll make, Martin says he cannot recall being razzed by other children, either about being adopted or about being Native American. My gosh, did you know Martin? Do you know Martin? Okay. So you know this story. You know where this is going. All right. Which is not to say that he wasn't conscious of being both. When he felt anxious or alienated, he told himself that adoption must be at the heart of it. His parents loved him, he felt that. But there were empty spots in his heart that they couldn't fill. He felt that too. Today, he believes that being adopted may actually have helped him sort through feelings of anxiety, identity, and the inadequacies of love as a cure-all. It gives you license, he says. It lets you blame everything on one thing. Once you trace everything to that, other things become easier. Martin Simon was 28 years old, a White House news photographer, and living what he calls a carefree life when he picked up the phone one day and got a message from the woman who'd given birth to him. Her name was Nikki. She had become pregnant. In trouble was the way we phrased it then. The age of 15, she was a student at an esteemed high school in one of Chicago's poshest suburbs. I talk about what happened to her then. Nikki had given birth to her son and handed him to a hospital nurse. In time, she met someone and they married. But they didn't have children, and she didn't tell him she'd ever had a baby. Nikki thought of her son a lot over the years, but she held herself back from trying to contact him, even when she had a bout with cancer and worried she might die without ever meeting her son, because she had read that adoptive children needed to be at least 28 before they'd absorbed enough of life to meet their birth mother and have a chance of grasping why she might have given them up for adoption. Martin and Nikki talked on the phone a long time. He'd been reared by two compassionate parents, and he found himself touched by Nikki's story and moved by her concern for the son she'd never met, which had kept her away for so long. They made plans to meet in 2 weeks. Martin took a breath and called his parents. Jean and Paul Simon said they were pleased and a little breathless. Jean said, well, thank God this didn't happen when you were 14, which I translate as her thinking, thank God this is happening now when you're already standing on your own 2 feet. Parents who adopt, however well we've been prepared by books, workshops, and counseling to welcome such contact, however grateful we are that our children have the chance to know those who gave birth to them, may forgive ourselves for harboring a lurking vulnerability. If and when we ever get a call like that, we will be genuinely pleased for our child. But we may also grieve and gnash somewhere inside. As Martin, who is now a father of 2 teenagers, says, it's every parent's fear. Given the chance, will my children really want to leave me? Nikki lived on the West Coast. She and Martin made arrangements to meet in Chicago in 2 weeks. They found themselves circling each other, dazed with amazement in the baggage claim area of O'Hare, detecting and delighting over similarities they could see in their faces, in the way they stood, walked, and waved. Nikki had light brown hair like Martin's. She looked about as American Indian as Diana, Princess of Wales. Hours later, after they'd told their stories, swapped stories, laughed, and done a little crying for each other, Martin asked, how are we Indian? Nikki looked puzzled. It was on my birth certificate, he explained. All those years I've been growing up thinking, oh, that, Nikki said as something suddenly snapped into place. At the hospital, they asked me to tick off some box, white, Negro, Asian, whatever, and I said, oh, we're all American. Got marked down as Native American. Turns out they were Swedish. And Martin said to me a few months ago, I'd already gone to all those powwows. He said, I don't know how to be Swedish. They made plans to meet again in Washington, D.C., where Martin lived, where Jean and Paul Simon lived when the Senate was in session. Jean Simon told Martin how happy she was for him. Her words were warm, but Martin thought they sounded a little brittle, a little unconvinced. You'll appreciate this section in particular, Cheryl. Jean was a deaf politician. She had applauded, saluted, and cheered for many candidates over the years who had shared a party line and knew how to roar with zest for contenders she didn't know and even louder for those she knew well enough to detest. Jean Simon knew when she had to make a good show. Paul advised Martin, son, you're going to have to be especially good to your mom these next few weeks. Nikki arrived at Martin's apartment first. They were having drinks and laughing a little too loudly when the doorbell rang. Jean and Paul Simon walked in, and Jean strode straight for Nikki. When Martin tells the story now, he has to stop, steady himself, clear his throat, and blink. Jean Simon walked up to the woman who gave birth to her son and hugged her. Nice to meet you, Nikki, she said and smiled. Between the two of us, we sure created something pretty special, didn't we? I'm so lucky, Martin says a little later. He and Nikki are good friends now, and even more, not mother and son exactly, but devoted friends with a place in each other's lives and a permanent stake in each other's happiness. Jean Simon died in 2000, Paul in 2003. Nikki, who's only 15 years older than her son, has become a kind of older family member who knows him less well than an aunt or a cousin with whom he grew up, but is getting to know him better now. Martin apologizes for having to stop and steady himself as he tells the story, has to hold himself back again. I'm sorry, he says finally, but I really miss my mom. There's no doubt, none, about whom he means. Now, I read that story now. There's some obvious local interest, both Illinois and Washington, D.C. Also, as I don't mind saying, I have covered enough politicians and enough politics to to understand that it's the rare public person who looks even better close up than they do from a distance. And Paul Simon, Jean Simon were those people. And that's rare enough that I'd like to note it. I miss him. You know, and in the end, I think of this as a book of romances, of love stories. It's about how people find each other, fall in love, and make lives together. And my wife and I grew to feel very strongly about the fact that adoption, for most of us, is not some kind of trauma to be overcome. It's a blessing to be treasured because it transforms our flesh and blood and our dreams. I think we've grown to think there are even some advantages. I think when you have a family in the traditional manner, you might accept things. Yeah, of course I love you. You're my son. Oh, yeah, come on. Well, what do you mean? Of course I love you. I think in those of us who are families that are blessed by adoption, I think we feel inspired sometimes to utter things aloud about how deeply and poignantly we cherish each other and love each other. Because I think we might be in some marginally better position to understand how important it is to be able to do that. My wife and I also felt it was important to try and open a window on adoption for people who maybe never thought of it or had only thought of it or thought that maybe one day they'll get around to it. You don't necessarily have to leave it as we did as a kind of last resort. And we also learned that despite the publicity that families like ours get, you know, the actual number of adoptions are down. There are a number of reasons for that, and many of them are good. And I touched on them a bit because we're living in a time when there's so many accomplished ways to have families. And I'm glad for all of them. We obviously tried a few ourselves. But you know, as of this week, there are an estimated 150 million orphaned, abandoned, and relinquished children in the world today. Now, these are children who are growing up without families or homes. They're growing up in institutions or in fields or on the streets. And as W.H. Auden said, each of us craves not universal love, but the chance to be loved alone. Those children are ours too, and they need and they deserve the love of parents. And I guess my wife and I have grown to feel that putting children who need love and care into families who crave the love of children is one of the great unfinished endeavors of the world. I think nothing would do more to increase the amount of happiness on this planet. And that's the kind of global warming that we could all use. And I think the glow from that warmth could light the world. So let me take your questions. I don't know what kind of time constraints we have here, but and I think am I also signing books too? Afterward, because we're coming up on Memorial Day, and I think nothing says Happy Memorial Day better than a signed book. Yeah, so do people just come forward, Cheryl? Yeah, okay, thank you. Anyone? Believe you me, I'm not so complete. Thank you.
Scott, you talk about not trying to judge the Chinese government and
Yeah.
yet bemoaning the fact that there's so many Chinese baby girls. Can you talk about how you feel like you're talking about and writing this book might be making any headway or might be educating people about how
Yeah.
to change the policy, either American leaders putting pressure or Chinese folks thinking about it?
Maybe in one small matter, I think we're learning in a variety of policy areas that my wife and I are flying out to Los Angeles on Monday to Julie McCarthy, our esteemed reporter who's based in Islamabad, is getting a well-deserved award. And I remember something Julie said to me years ago when she was on a reporting trip to China, where she said, to stand on any street corner in Shanghai or Beijing is to understand they really don't care what we think when all is said and done. It's the Middle Kingdom. I think in the main there's something to that. And I do want understood, I mean, my wife and I feel that the one-child policy is a hideous violation of human rights. That is not why we adopted children from China. We're not that good. We're not motivated that way. At the time we applied, China just had the most expeditious program going. And we were told that once our application was approved, we could have a child within 9 months. It turned out to be 18 months for Elise and 2 years for Lena. That being said, we are now half a Chinese family. And we feel it incumbent upon ourselves to make ourselves aware of China and to help our little girls be aware of the fact that obviously they're Chinese. There are a lot of things, but we want them to understand that. Since the book came out, there's some people who approached me, and actually I've brought the idea to that other Chicagoan who's the Secretary of State, which I think is a good idea. Practically, I don't know as we'll ever be in a position to know the birth mothers of our children. You can never rule out the effect of history, though. And the idea that we brought, and I have no idea if it's going to fly, but I think people in the State Department are interested, is beginning a registry, a DNA registry of youngsters who are adopted from China, so that at some point in the future, if the technology continues to develop, and if certain changes in China develop, it might in fact be possible to be able to eventually trace the family lineage. And maybe that's as close as we can come. You know, the waiting list for children from China now is, I think, between 5 and 6 years. And I think if my wife and I were adopting today, we would go elsewhere. 5 and 6 years, I honestly can't imagine what family would be able to sign up under those circumstances. But we do feel that it's important to have our children, and us for that matter, try and connected to and sensitive to events in China. And, the hard part it's funny, people sometimes say, have you told your children they're adopted? As if somehow, like at the age of 11 or 12, we'd go to Elise and say, baby, now you may have noticed that you and Dad are a little different in appearance or something. So they have always known they're adopted, and I think they're comfortable with that. And I think we pretty much think we can begin to explain at some level now why they're from China and why we went to China. The day is going to come when we're going to be at a reunion with the families who adopted, and one of them is going to turn around and say, how come we're all girls? And that's going to be harder to handle. Yes, sir. I'm so glad that.
I just want to thank you in 3 ways for writing the book, for coming here today, and for making such a great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. He said something very nice orally. You speak English better than I speak French. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Can you step up some?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, what, ma'am? Yeah.
There are get-togethers for adopted children and their parents. I know Wisconsin has one in the summer for a week or two where the children who came in a group
Yeah.
adopted, or didn't you? weren't you
No,
part of
we were with 4 other families for our first adoption, and just with one other family from Annapolis, actually from our second adoption. And yes, we do get together with them. You know, there are families who are more observant of that than we are. We travel a lot. I mean, we began the week very thrillingly watching. We are friends with an astronaut who's aboard STS-134, and we got to see his launch. And you know, I'm blessed enough to be in a position where we get to take our kids interesting places, and so we do that. They used to go to a Sunday Mandarin Chinese culture class. Elise is 8, and I think speaks Mandarin pretty well. But when it gets to the point when they tell you there are other things they would rather be doing with their time, I think you have to respect it, or at least as my wife and I say, you can drag the kids to Mandarin class, but you can't make them speak. And we noticed that the only word they seem interested in bringing home was, and some people here might know it, pigu, derriere. And it's in fact a great word, and it's our family default word for derriere. But in any event, at some point they might express more interest in it, and we'll be sensitive to that. To Chinese food? You know, this is the wonderful thing about America. You don't have to introduce them to Chinese food. I mean, I think they like Mr. Chen's noodles as almost their favorite, but I don't kid myself that that there's any great cultural commitment to the fact that they like Mr. Chen's noodles. You know, we live right above the noodle shop, and I think a lot of people in the building like Mr. Chen's noodles. So, you know, I think you can exaggerate that. There are people who've come up to us and say, you know, our children are going to speak Mandarin fluently. And by the way, I think it would be good for everybody's kids to learn Mandarin. I don't necessarily think that because a lot of our daughters happen to be, yes, you know, adopted from China, the onus should be greater on them. Our daughters do speak French very well, which is important in our family, and we think that's kind of neat in any case. I think everybody could stand to learn Chinese, obviously, at this particular point. We've adopted 2 real little girls. They are not vessels of a culture, or more than vessels of a culture. And I think you, as parents, you have to respond to the ways in which they're growing up and their interests. Now, you know, all of that being noted, they might be passionately interested in their heritage at some point, and we'll follow through to let them learn that. People come up to me and say, you know, our children will learn Mandarin fluently, or if they're adopted from Ethiopia, or they're going to learn Amharic fluently, and we're going to celebrate all the 200 national holidays and that sort of thing. And my wife and I can tell they're new at it, and we want to say to them, try getting them to eat broccoli first. Our children, of course, love broccoli. Yes, ma'am.
If you were adopting now, what countries or places or sources would you look to avoid 5 to 6 years for China?
You know, I'm not an expert on that. I don't know. At the time, pardon me? Oh, yeah. If we were adopting now, what countries would we go to? You know, I'm not an expert on that. At the moment we were making the decision, we were told that domestic adoption was difficult for us because of a variety of reasons, beginning with my age, not my wife's, that we would be at the back of a line. I had spent a considerable time in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian program just had no slots at that point. I'd spent a lot of time in Bosnia and the Balkans, and the good news there was that there weren't many slots there. Whereas China, for a lot of reasons, had a very expeditious program, so that's what we applied there. It's my understanding that Ethiopia has opened up more at this particular point, but I mean, that's Gesundheit. That's why you go to reliable, reputable adoption agencies to give you that kind of guidance. I guess we can take one more question, and then I was told 5 minutes, so. Yes. I know, actually, yeah, that's it.
You said you went to the non-chain Walmart. Like, what was your experience when I was there?
The Nanchang Walmart? Have you been to the Nanchang Walmart? It's quite a place, isn't it? Nanchang, we should explain, is like the city that considers itself home of Mao's revolution. And so in the central square of Nanchang, which I think is the second largest central square in China, or so we were told, you see a statue of the great helmsman, Chairman Mao, pointing like this, and he seems to be pointing to the Walmart. I guess that's what happened. And it's dazzling. And you can get the squeaky shoes there. Some of you might be familiar with squeaky, when you're learning to walk or just want to keep track of your child, I suppose. They're great. They've got these little squeakers in the soles, and you can get them as we did. We got them to kind of follow them through to like the age of 3. We got them in all sizes that we could, and I miss those squeaky shoes. There's something really nice about, I love to hear the squeak in the hallways. It speaks to how things are changing in China. It also in some ways speaks to how things are not changing in China. I mean, Walmart is a huge, vast commercial enterprise that I think fits very nicely into the kind of commercial despotism that is also China at the same time. But we wouldn't, that's where we were taken to shop, and we wouldn't pass up the chance. The food section there is extraordinary, but not quite what we're used to. I mean, they've got stuff hanging, pickled, right? That just, yeah. We didn't bring back, but that's from the Nanchang Walmart. This little white dress. Well, thank you very much.